We're talking about 1 Peter. And when we talk about 1 Peter, one of the things that we have to deal with is the fact that it deals with the whole concept of suffering. In the world today, across the world, Christians, and that's anybody that claims to be a Christian, I'm not judging or that, just using terminology, 360 million today will be persecuted for one reason or another, in one shape or another. They will suffer persecution, and many of them will be martyred. And this happens across the world. Now, our has changed, and we may suffer some indignation and problems, but so far, it's not been like that. But when it comes, I want you to read 1 Peter. That needs to be a book that you go to. He deals with this. Peter was an apostle, had been preaching for 30 years, and has had problems. He's been arrested. He's been tried. He's had problems as a Christian. And when he writes this letter, he's got problems. He's in prison, and he has been condemned to death, and he's waiting to be martyred, which he was. And so he writes this letter to those that were out in the world, free from prison at least. And so he wants to encourage them that as life throws problems our way, there is a way of dealing with it. And he deals with this extensively. Nero, as I commented, one of the most ungodly reprobates that has ever lived. And yet he was the emperor of the world. And so he arrested Peter and he arrested Paul and put both of them to death, and then many other Christians also. He condemned many of the Christians, blaming them for the fire that destroyed Rome. We don't know who started it. It surely wasn't the Christians, and they got blamed for it anyway. And then Peter was executed somewhere, AD 64, 67, shortly after he wrote this book. And I've always been challenged. If I was in prison, knowing I was about to die, what would I write to you? Oh, pray for me. I've got it so bad. It'd be a poor pity letter. And Peter's not all like that. Peter's encouraging us that are free on how we can deal with the problems of the world. And so he mentions suffering, suffered, suffer some 16 times in 5 little short chapters. That's the main subject. You can't miss it if you just go through and begin circling those words. And then when you multiply that by the verses that talk about suffering, that don't say suffer, it's multiplied. So I turn to this book regularly when things are not going right. And the first thing I do is I thank God, whatever problems I have, it's not like what I'm reading. Not nearly as bad, not as hard to deal with. And so in this, he talks about not suffering because we got appendicitis or we stubbed our toe. He's talking about suffering because you're a Christian, because you have faith in Jesus Christ. And so he talks about that they would revile our good behavior. That's assuming you have good behavior. You need to make sure that's what you're doing. And then sometimes the response will be ridicule and reviling and snarky comments and things that are just difficult to deal with. He said they were reviled and they suffered for the name of Christ. That is, not because of worldly problems per se, illness or that, but because they claim, I believe in Jesus Christ and I follow him. And that got them in all kinds of trouble on that. And so a third time, he says, if you're going to suffer, you make sure you suffer as a Christian. One thing is, you got to be a Christian to suffer as a Christian. Second of all, when you suffer, you need to act like a Christian during the suffering. You're going to suffer as a Christian would suffer. And both sides of that equation are absolutely necessary on this. And many times when we think of persecution, we immediately picture Rome as the big culprit of that. And I've learned, I'm just going to give you a brief overview. Rome wasn't the big nasty persecutor all of the time. They did their share. And it was difficult at times to be a Christian. But when we talk about Rome, when Nero persecuted, it was almost exclusively in the area of Rome and didn't deal with Galatia, which is our Turkey. It didn't deal with Judea and Jerusalem. It didn't deal with the Germanic, European part. It was there. But then he died, and a couple emperors later, Domitian came. I want you to do some quick math in there. If you subtract 65 from 95, now you all notice I made it easy for you. It's not 66 from 95. But what you end up with is 29 years of relative peace that Christians weren't persecuted by the Romans. But when Domitian came, he made up for it. And the few years he was an emperor, he persecuted the Christians. And then they had peace for a few years. And then plenty persecuted the Christians. And then they had 40 some odd years where the Romans just left them alone. One of the reasons is the Christians in the first century only made up 1, 2, maybe 3% of the empire. They weren't on anybody's radar. They didn't register. Now, today, those in America that claim to be Christians, whatever stripe and however deep that may go, is still a majority, but it's dwindling. I'm sad, but it is dwindling. And that's the way that goes. But then, again, at the end of that, it picked up again. And then finally, in the year 300, you had the biggest persecution, but that's 250 years after Peter died. And so it's not just that. What the persecution was that got to most Christians are the things that you and I will probably have to deal with. Number one was fratricide. That is, the Jewish unbelievers persecuted the Jewish believers. And so if you were a Christian and you went into the synagogue like you always did, and they found out you were a Christian, you probably got kicked out. And they wouldn't let you back in. And you lost that family, that association, that support, that system that was there. And now your support and your family becomes the church, the other Christians on that. Most of it was local. When Paul went to Philippi, he was arrested and beaten and thrown in jail, and then he left. And when he got to Corinth, it was a new show. They weren't mad at him yet. It didn't take long. And because of his preaching and his teaching, and he turned them away from the idols and from their false worship, that they became angry at Paul. But it was local. And he would go to the next town and the next town. But here's the thing I want you to see. Even though it was local, it turned out to be for Paul every local. Town after town after town. He went in and he began teaching the gospel. And brethren, don't be ashamed of this. The gospel is narrow. The truth is narrow. Jesus likened it unto a broad way and a narrow way. And the way of truth has always been narrow, because truth is truth. It's not my truth and your truth. It's true or false. And so it is that way, and it caused problems. And people then turned from their false religions. And the people they used to worship with got angry with that. They quit observing the customs that were there. They no longer walked the way that their neighbors walked because they're Christians and they walk by a different standard. They serve God. That's the way it will always be for us. And then they were considered unpatriotic because the Romans, they would worship the emperor as Lord. And so they would call Christians in and ask you, would you just offer this in worship to Caesar as Lord? And if you were faithful to Jesus, you said no. Jesus is Lord. He's Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And Caesar is just a man that happens to rule. I will acknowledge him as a ruler, but not as Lord. And you're going to be persecuted. Don't know how severe, what all that they're going to do. But this was what they had to deal with. Now, do you all see? That's what we're going to deal with. It's not necessarily the government, but it will be your family, your friends, your co-workers. And when they find out, you will be tested. And they will set their sights on you to see how sincere is he about really following what Jesus says. And this is a normal part of being a disciple. It was true in the first century. It is true today. Jesus said, remember, if they persecuted me, did they? If they persecuted me, rewrite that for just a second. Since they have persecuted me, they will persecute you. If you're going to follow Jesus, be prepared to follow Jesus. And wherever he goes. And then the Apostle Paul said that all that would desire to live godly and do live godly will suffer persecution. If you're going to live righteously, do y'all realize if you live a godly life in our country today, you stand out like a sore thumb? It didn't used to be in the Leave It to Beaver world that I grew up in. It was pretty much everybody acted right. But that's just changing. Don't let it change you. Don't you change. You will be a follower of Jesus. And then again, Peter said, do not be surprised at this, at the fiery ordeal that comes. It's not a strange thing. Every generation has suffered some form. Now, most of it's been mild, but some of it has been absolutely heartbreaking and severe. He said, do not be surprised. Paul was beaten. James was beheaded. John was exiled. Jesus himself was crucified and reviled and spit upon. So it's not a strange thing. And if we're going to follow Jesus, just put on your hat. That's what's coming. Okay. Now we're going to deal with how to deal with that. So as we begin dealing with this, some years ago, I got trying to analyze all of the suffering that was going on. And I discovered that there are actually labels for all of the different kinds of suffering that Peter talks about. And so, for example, he talks about Jesus, he bore our sins. I always make those scriptures private and personal. He bore my sins. He suffered, although he didn't deserve it. He suffered for me. Now, I've discovered that's true in other things. How many of you suffered for your children? How many times when they did something, you were the one that had to pay the penalty or help them out? And that's a vicarious suffering. So you're going to read about Jesus, and that's how he suffered. But he also suffered not just for others, but in order to redeem us to save us, to allow us to be forgiven of our sins. And so many, many times, punishment and acts of people, again, back to parents, is redemptive. Trying to save, trying to lessen, trying to get them out of the trouble that they've been in. And this primarily is what Peter deals with the death of Jesus. Then, it's a testing. Every time you're suffering, it's a trying of man's souls. I always think back, great book of Job. And Satan accused him. He is, one of his titles is accuser. And he accused Job. God said, have you considered my Job, my servant? I have nobody like him that serves me. And Satan then accused him. Oh, he's serving you because you protected him and blessed him. But if you take away that, he'd curse you to your face. And God allowed Satan to test Job. You all better pray that he doesn't allow Satan to test us that way. But he will test us. And every time we face hardships in life, it is a testing of our faith. Will I remain faithful to God? Will I still do what is right, even if it costs me money or jobs or friends? And so many of the suffering, he said, is a testing, or as he said in verse 6, it's a trial of my conviction of my faith. How strong am I going to be? And I'm going to tell you, we have different levels of faith. Some people give in way too soon. It breaks your heart. And others, they're solid. And they go and they go and they go. And the only way that I'll ever find out about me is to be tested. And then the proof is the result. And so always understand, when it's happening, there is a test involved for that. And sometimes it's corrective. Now, God sometimes did this. The book of Amos, God sent drought, and God then sent floods, and God sent persecutions, and God sent various things, because what he was trying to do is get his people to repent. Going back to parents, how many times did we correct and punish our children? And usually said something that's going to hurt me more than it hurts you, and we need to quit saying that. But we're trying to get them to act right. We're trying to correct the bad behavior. We're trying to make it so uncomfortable if they do that they don't want to do that again. And that's what God often does. And so when you sin and are harshly treated for it, you deserve it. Now that's blunt, but that's the way that works. And if you're going to do that which is wrong, God is there and he knows. And so sometimes our suffering is because we're being corrected. And then sometimes if we refuse to be corrected, it turns out to be punishment. And he says and warns us, do not suffer as an evildoer. If you suffer as an evildoer, you deserve it. So don't go there. Now, I like preaching to the choir. I like looking out here and knowing who you are and how you live. And I pray that what I think I see is what you really are. And when the testing comes, you don't change. You are a child of God. But if you change, there is punishment. And there is judgment to come. And if we're going to suffer, let's make sure that it's unjust, that is not deserved. And that's what happened to Jesus. He didn't deserve it because he never sinned. And yet he suffered. And for us, we may, simply because we're Christians, have to deal with issues. But make sure it's because you are a Christian and not because you deserve that. Peter said, for example, that we are to bear up when we suffer unjustly. And it happens. That's most of what happens in the suffering of Christians that Peter talks about. And then I threw in one other, and it's consequential. You make dumb mistakes. You make dumb decisions. And you find out after you've done it, I shouldn't have done that. It's a consequence. For every choice you make, there is a consequence that you're going to have to deal with. A friend of mine the other day wrote, you have a choice of jumping off of a building. You don't have a choice of landing or not landing. There's a consequence. Sometimes we can alleviate the consequence before it happens, but many times, once we've made the choice, the consequence is there. And so, a lot of times, don't get mad at God, but figure it out. One morning I woke up in Tucson and I read the newspaper. And a young girl that had just turned 16, she had got her driver's license. And she asked her mom, she said, can I take my friend and we can go down and get an ice cream? I forget where they were going, but it's only about 6 blocks from their house. And so mom let her drive with her driver's license for the first time. And she comes up to the stoplight and she stops. And she waited for the green light. And when she got a green light, she went through the intersection and wham! A man that was drunk ran a red light, broadsided the driver's side of the car, and she was killed instantly. And so, as they always do, they talk with the family to write the newspaper. And the mom said, well, I have to deal with this. It was God's will. And I slammed the paper down because it wasn't God's will that that man was drunk. Y'all know that? It was God's will that if you run red lights, you probably are going to hit somebody. It is God's will that when a 3,000-pound car made out of metal hits a body made out of flesh, there's going to be carnage. But it was not God's will that that girl died that day. There was sin, there was consequence, there was bad choices that were made, and there were some innocent choices that were made. Just don't go down that road. Just acknowledge life has problems and keep going, and it's consequential. Peter said, if it be God's will, doing what is right rather than suffering what is wrong. And then a lot of things happen in life, and I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know why. Years ago, a friend of mine became an expert in investing. And he talked me into pulling my money out of an 8% guaranteed fund and putting it in the stock market. And then came Black Monday. I did it on Friday, and by Monday, it was gone. Why? Well, that's the way stock markets go. That's the way it works with investing. That's what happens. And it was nobody's fault per se. It was a consequence. And so some are just unexplained. The secret things belong unto God, and He's not told us everything. Why? Why am I 5'4"? I'm going to tell you, I've asked that question. And my brother always laughs and said, because Grandma was 4'9". And you took after Grandma rather than Grandpa, who was 6'3". It's all about genetics. So I can answer that, but why did the genes get structured that way? Couldn't it have just as easy? Some things we'll never have answers for, but you learn to live with that. So how do we begin dealing with all of this, the suffering that happens in life? And in particular, suffering because I'm a Christian. And the answer to that is, number one, I'm going to keep an absolutely clear conscience. I've talked about this a couple weeks ago. The conscience is your inner judge that judges whether you acted according to what you understand is right or what you acted according to what you understand is wrong. Now, you may have understood it wrong. That's why the conscience is not 100% good. But if I think it's wrong, don't do it. And if you think it's the right thing to do, it doesn't matter what the consequences are. Do what is right. And so we keep an absolute clear conscience. And Peter said that, chapter 3, verse 16. We are to keep a conscience so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior will be put to shame. If you are doing what is right and they slander you, you know you didn't do it. How many of you have been falsely accused of something? I didn't do it. Isn't that the first thing you say? To yourself? To everybody around? I didn't do it. Your conscience is clean. Your conscience needs to stay clean. And the only way it stays clean is if you think it's wrong, you don't do it. Doesn't matter who's there or what it costs or what it is. I will only do. Now, educate your conscience. Think about it. Study, read, ask, listen. Because many times our conscience needs to be corrected. But as it's corrected, keep the conscience. And if you're going to suffer, make sure that you suffer according to the will of God. Peter said, those who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator. Not that it was God's will that happened to you. What Peter's talking about here is, how do I respond to it? And you respond to it according to the teaching that God has given to us. You get reviled, so you revile back. No. You get treated evil, so you get even. No. Christians live by a different standard and a different concept. That is hard. I'm going to tell you, how many movies have been made about getting even? How many movies has the good guy become the bad guy? Well, he becomes the bad guy because he does the same thing the bad guy is doing. He's doing it for a good motive. No, he's doing it to get even. And we don't live like that. Are you willing to just take it? Are you willing to be godly, even though those things have happened? That's what he said. We are to suffer according to the will of God and entrust our souls to God who is absolutely faithful. Well, if I don't get even, bottom line is God will. God will judge evildoers. Today, don't know when. It may not be until the last day and the judgment. But it is rest assured, God will make everything right and fair and just in the end. Make sure you're right with God. How do I deal with such? It's temporary. Warning. The temporary for Peter was he died. But the moment he died, that's all over. That's all done. The suffering ends. And now it's glory and honor and rest and peace. It's temporary. If it's not temporary that it quits, it's temporary in this life. And so Peter said, after you have suffered for a little while. Have you ever, when you were in school, had a class where you didn't like the subject and you didn't like the teacher? And sign up for those. And my advice is this: tough it out. It's temporary. And then it'll be done. And when it's done, you don't have to look back. My son, one time, he had a class last semester. It was the last class that he had to take. And the teacher was absolutely horrible, and the subject was absolutely abysmal. And he recognized it was one of those classes, I probably won't ever deal with that again. When was the last time I used geometry? Oh. So it's temporary. And once you get done with that, you maybe ask your grade point average for the first job. I'm going to tell you, I've never been asked my grade point average in college. Not even on the first job. Because my first job, I had in college. And they didn't care. And so, you tough it out. But that's not just true of grades. That's true of a lot of things in your life. The situation will change. Then, recognize when it comes down to the end, whatever I suffer as a Christian is going to be absolutely worth whatever it was. Peter says, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while you're distressed by various trials. The proof of your faith being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, your faith may be found to result in praise and glory and honor. Stand before God on the day of judgment. And He looks down and says, well done, you good and faithful servant. Enter in to the joys of your Lord. Do you know what you're going to feel like then? You're going to feel like a kid the first time he goes through Disneyland. Only better. Disneyland closes. We're going for eternity. Glory and honor and praise. You're faithful now. You suffer now. But eternity is joy and honor and peace. Now that's going to require some patience. It's going to require some endurance. It's going to require steadfastness. And Peter talks about how when you are persecuted, you endure it with patience. And you have to. It's not fun. But I can do this. And so you tough it out. And in doing that, you don't take a martyr complex. You don't just, tough it out and whatever will be is going to be. No, you get up and you do what's right. And if you get knocked down for doing what's right, get up and do it again. And you keep getting up and you keep getting up and you keep doing what is right. And you begin trusting God. And Peter said in chapter 4, verse 19, the way to do that is you entrust your soul to a faithful Creator. What that means is the first thing is pray. Pray that you have strength. Pray that it is temporary. Pray that you can conduct yourself as God would have you to conduct. Pray for the enemy. You know, the Psalms have what we call imprecatory psalms. And that's a big word for saying, Lord, knock their teeth out. Not that kind of prayer. As Jesus prayed, Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So we respond by having absolute trust and faith in God when that happens. Because He cares for you. You are more valuable than gold. You are worth more than the sparrows. You are God's people. He cares for you. Well, if He cared for me, why am I suffering? I don't know. Take your pick. There are 6, 7, 8 different things that it may be, and it may be 2 or 3 of them wrapped together. One of the elders in Tucson one time, lightning struck his wooden shed that he stored all of his stuff in and burned it down. And so he made a claim to his insurance company. And you all know what the insurance company said? That was an act of God. I told him, I said, sue him. Because it wasn't an act of God. You're a child of God, an elder in the Lord's church. God didn't burn down your shed. If anything, it would have been Satan. You'll never win that in court, by the way. Save your money and suck it up and do what you're going to do with it. But my point is, you make a choice. I don't know why it's happening, but I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to serve God. I'm going to worship God and be faithful. And in doing that, I'm going to tell you, a lot of times when something bad happens to you, it opens a door for you to serve God. A preacher's wife, very godly woman, she had a lot of medical problems. And the problems ended up that she ended up not only with a hysterectomy and could never have children, but a colostomy. She ended up having to wear a bag and that. And the first reaction is, oh, poor me, I can. And she did a different approach. And so anytime that anybody was in the hospital that had similar or that kind of operation, when they woke up in that hospital bed, she was sitting in a chair next to the bed. And she would hold their hand and she said, I went through this. The problems you think you're going to have, they're not problems. Here's the problems you will have. And she began explaining what life was like for her. And she walked people through the process so that they didn't have to fret and worry. And she helped. Could she have done that? I'm going to tell you what, you can't do that. I can't do that. She could do that. So, as Mr. Rogers' mother used to say, anytime there's a problem, look for the helpers. There's always helpers. And you be one of the helpers. If you have these trials, use it. Learn from it. And use the experience to support and help, encourage others. So, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, that you'll be able to give an answer when somebody said, why? Because they don't understand. Why? Why do you believe in God? Why do you believe in Jesus? Why do you attend church? Why were you baptized? Now, you may not have answers for those, but you should. And you need to think about it. Why? And if you're here this morning, why not? You're going to suffer anyway. You know, I've often thought, did anybody ever say to themselves, I'm going to be a non-Christian because non-Christians never suffer? Not in your life. But we suffer as Christians. But you have to be a Christian. And to be a Christian, you need to arise and be baptized, wash away your sins, become a child of God. Of course, that means you believe. That means you're sorry for the sins you've done. You repent. You're willing to tell people, I believe in Jesus. But you need to be baptized. And if you're willing to do that, we invite you to come as together we stand and as we sing.